Welcome to the Oscar II Operation and Maintenance Training video. If you haven't already, we strongly encourage you to watch the Oscar II installation video before continuing on. If you've seen that video, we'll go ahead and outline the rest of our presentation today. We want to go through the certification process of how to become a certified professional on our list. We'll cover what the Oscar II is, some of the startup procedures, and then basic operation and maintenance procedures. The certification process starts with a classroom or as you're doing the online training. Once you've completed that training, your name will go on the list of what we call the certified professionals, which we'll then post on our website. And then we typically, not always, but we typically try to go through the first operation and maintenance inspection on site or in the field. Sometimes we do this over the phone. We may do it by FaceTime, whatever the case requires. And then after that, any additional training is needed. We're always available for phone calls, emails. Sometimes we'll work through texting pictures back and forth, and then a phone call, depending upon the circumstance. Now, once you've completed this video, give Low Ridge a call. We'll have a brief conversation. We may emphasize a few things, answer any of your questions. At that point, we'll gain or glean some information from you, put your name on the list, and get that posted, and then there we'll start. Now, when we post it on our website, you'll find it under the heading of Certified Professionals. That list will look like this. We'll put it in alphabetical order by last name. We'll also identify the county you're located in. That's not a requirement or a limitation of where you can practice. It's just to give someone a geographical idea of where you're located. Whatever phone number you would like to have for contact information, and then we'll check off whether you're operation and maintenance, installation, or sometimes both. Now, to get into what the Oscar II system is, it's a very basic technology. It only has a few components. We usually start out with a 1,000-gallon, what we call treatment vessel, a 1,000-gallon pump chamber, a reverse flush headworks that's located on top of the 1,000-gallon pump chamber here, and then the Oscar drain field or disposal component would be the fourth item. The term Oscar, the name Oscar, is an acronym that stands for on-site sand coil area recharge, and it actually describes what it is and what it does. In this illustration here, you see an Oscar that is almost complete. We'll just need to put the cover sand over the top of here to finish off its installation. The Oscar is a proprietary technology that treats wastewater and also is a final dispersal component in one unit. The Oscar actually has two main components. We have our pre-assembled coils. We have a 50-gallon-a-day version and a 100-gallon-a-day version. And then we'll also have either C33 sand, or in some jurisdictions it'll be medium sand. And depending upon the criteria, we may have as little as 6 inches of sand under the coils to as much as 12 inches, depending upon, again, the local requirements. The coil, once it's completely assembled, will look like this. This is our 50-gallon-a-day coil, or 5-foot diameter coil. This particular unit is 25 feet of net-of-fin bioline. It has an emitter spacing of every 6 inches. So in this arrangement, we have 50 emitters for a 25 square foot area. The white PVC pipe is just a bracket that holds the coil in shape, and the green is just a background for contrast. When the Oscar is installed, the cross-sectional view will be a layer of sand that's on a prepared ground or basal surface. We'll have, again, 6 or 12 depending upon the local criteria. We'll have a coil. In this case, we're showing the 5-foot coil, and then a minimum of 6 inches of sand over the top of that. We do have a couple of inspection ports for observation operation maintenance observations. Once the Oscar is actually in place and in use, Grass and other vegetation grows quite readily. It is a subsurface irrigated media with nutrients. You can see here, this is the sand that does not have any Oscar coils in it. We do have a slope here of about maybe 10%. Our coils are level along this grade here, and you can see how lush the grass growth is. And that's typically what we see after an installation has been in for a growing season or so. Now the treatment vessel, depending upon the locale where you're in, for instance, to Washington State, we would use a treatment vessel that's another treatment technology. In other states, it could be as simple as a single compartment septic tank. The discharge tank, at a minimum, is 1,000 gallons. We'll have a single pump in there with 2 floats. Pretty simple, pretty basic arrangement. We'll go into the details of placement and setting here in a little bit. And this is an aerial photograph of an Oscar system that's been installed but not quite backfilled. We have 8 5-foot diameter coils for a 360 gallon a day installation. Now it's important to understand the startup procedures. This is the process that we'd go through once the system has been installed, wiring has been complete, and then it'd be a quality control check to make sure, again, the wiring is completed and we didn't have any broken or misplumbed pipes. But it's also an important process from an operation and maintenance standpoint. If nothing else, if someone went through the operation and maintenance, or excuse me, the startup procedures, it would identify problems either with a valve being bad or a miswire or some other hydraulic issue. So we're going to start with the startup procedures first. Excuse me, and as we do that, we'll be checking the wiring on the floats, pumps, valves, make sure those are done correctly, and then we'll also be measuring and recording the flows and pressures through the flow meter and our pressure gauges. So doing the startup, this will help us to diagnose problems with the system. It's very easy if once we know what it's supposed to happen in a proper functioning system. If we don't get those proper indicators, it actually gives us indication of where the problem is and what to look at. So the float wiring, we're going to be looking at 2 aspects. One is going to be proper wiring connections inside the panel, and then we're going to look at the proper float positioning within the tank itself. So in our control panel, we have the bus terminal where all the wires are connected, divided into 3 sections by these 2 yellow dividers. Everything to the left of the dividers is going to be for the floats. And the floats, we have 2. You can test the floats in 2 ways. One is just to raise the floats. For instance, if we lift the top float, hold it for 5 seconds, we'll get an alarm. There's a 5-second delay, so we'll get an alarm. We can raise the bottom float and just wait a few minutes, and the pump will cycle. If for some reason the pump isn't wired correctly, or we don't have power to it, you could be standing there for quite a long time holding this float up, waiting for it to cycle. I prefer to use the input-output screen option to check the float positions. In our control panel, we have we call supplemental wiring diagrams that show how the floats are supposed to be wired. In that bus terminal, it's the first 1 through 4 are for the floats, and the diagram actually shows us the bottom float, which is in the lower position, will be wired to the number 1, number 2. The high level or top float, which will be higher than the bottom float, will be wired in positions 3 and 4. And then we also indicate what input, and we'll show you what that means in a minute, what input those floats represent. So here we have on the left our wiring diagram. On the right, we have the Siemens logo, and the power is off. So if we cycle the power off and turn it back on, what will always happen is we'll get a little indicator light that will start to come on as soon as we turn the power on. Once we get adequate power, this will turn green. Once it turns green, then the first screen that always comes up is the pump cycle and pump runtime screen. Pump number one is our discharge pump for the Oscar system. When we scroll down, use the down arrow, we'll scroll down about 4 or 5 screens, and we come to this date and time stamp. It's flashing, doesn't matter if it's set. Then we use the left arrow, indicating here, to get to the screen where it has the large capital I in the upper corner. Sorry, that's a little bit in the way. But what you'll see on this top row, we're only concerned about inputs 1 through 5. Number 1, which represents the bottom float, you'll see that it's backlit. And that indicates that on this system, that float is up, or the float switch is closed, indicating that if we have the bottom float up, that's in the right position. You'll see here input 2 is the top float, and in this case we will be looking at here and saying, well, that top float be hanging down. So this would be in a normal condition. We have a bottom float that's up, we're waiting to dose. We don't have an alarm condition, so number 2 is not backlit. Now our float positions within the tank, we want to have the bottom float above, at or above, usually above a few inches, the top of the pump. We want to make sure that the wet end on top of this pump is always submerged. And then the top float or alarm float only needs to be about 4 or 5 inches above the bottom float. Now, if you're concerned about a high water table and buoyancy and those sorts of things, you can shift these floats up a little bit. We want to make sure that we still maintain some emergency storage above this top float. But we have a very short, shallow working volume. The timer settings for this is very short, about 3 minutes 38 seconds off and 22 seconds on. So as soon as that bottom float comes up, we're going to be dosing water out of here fairly frequently. Small doses, but very, very frequent, so we don't need a large working volume in this tank. Now our reverse flush headworks that actually keeps the Oscar coils operating and clean automatically. We use this headworks with 5 valves, a disc filter, and a number of pressure gauges to indicate proper operation. This headworks was not configured so that it was simple to know how it operated, but it was configured so that it would fit in a relatively small valve box and still be serviceable. So a little information about our headworks. The standard for single family residence is going to have a 3/4 inch disc filter. That disc filter is about 120 mesh, or the equivalent of 130 micron opening size. We have 5 normally closed solenoid valves and 3 pressure gauges. Now these solenoid valves, they're not irrigation valves. They are made for sewage application. All these valves are normally closed, which means in order for water to flow through the valves, we need to have both electrical impulse at 24 volts and at least 15 psi to open the valves. I think it's actually more like 8 psi. In any event, we need to have the pump running and electricity to the valves to get them to open. Now the valves, the hardware for the valves are coordinated with the firmware in the control panel to give us what I call 3 valve functions, V1, V2, and V3. V1 is our dose. That's what we'll be dosing the Oscar. V2 or valve 2 function is going to backflush the disc filter, and then V3 is going to be a coil flush to clean the coils out, and then we repeat the cycles starting again with valve 1 or V1. Our default setting, we're going to get 90 doses, and our dose cycles are going to be 3 minutes 38 seconds off, 22 seconds on. We're going to do that 90 times. After the 90th time, then we'll go to V2. We'll have a short rest, and then we'll backflush that disc filter for 15 seconds. Then we'll have a short rest of 30 seconds, and then we'll flush the coils for 2 minutes. Once that's completed, we'll go back to 90 dose cycles. And that just, as long as there's water available and our timer on float is up, those cycles will continue in perpetuity. So our valves are going to be wired between the 2 yellow tabs. And our supplemental diagram looks like this. We label the solenoids or the valves as solenoids 1 through 5. Each solenoid has two wires or leads. One wire from each solenoid is tied together in one common wire, which goes back to the control panel in V1 or VN position. Solenoids 1 and 2 operate together, so they're tied together in common for valve position 1. Again, this will be our dose cycle. Valves 3 and 4, solenoids 3 and 4, they work in parallel. They're tied together, and that's our disc filter backflush. And valve 5, or solenoid 5, is kind of an outlier. It operates in conjunction with valves 1 and 2. So V1 and V3 operate together when it's time to do the coil flush. So here's how we'd go through and manually operate the sequences to validate the correct wiring and hydraulic flow. First, we would turn our pump on. We've got 4 toggle switches in our control panel. The top one is pump 1. Turn that to manual or hand. And then again, we need to get power to our valves 1 and 2. So we're going to put that toggle switch to hand. And what that will do in our headworks, it will turn on the pump and solenoids 1 and 2, and the flow path for the water will follow the green line here. Valves 3, 4, and 5 are all closed, so no water flows through those positions. And within the system, this is what it would look like. Again, from the pump through the headworks, forward flow, out our 2 coil or 2 Oscar position, energize the coils, and of course what I'm not showing is that we would actually then deadhead against the valve here in the headworks. So this would be our V1 or dose cycle. When we do that, the pressures on our gauges, we should expect to see gauges 1 through 3 have virtually the same pressure in a very narrow range of somewhere between about 48 and 52 psi. Now the flow, depending upon the size of our Oscar system, will dictate the actual flow of the emitter discharge rate. The more coils we have, the bigger the flow will have. Our OS50 coils, or 5-foot coils, each have a flow rate of about 0.35 gallons a minute. So if we've got 10 coils, we're going to have about 3.5 gallons a minute. At least we should be able to verify or look close to that. If we're using the OS100s, or 7-foot coils, each of those coils is twice as large, so we have twice the flow rate at 0.7 gallons per minute. So there's a little bit of math that needs to be done here to know how to verify the actual flows. Now to measure the flows, we use a flow meter. It's the most accurate way to do that. Now the flow meter that we use for the standard system is a 3/4 inch filter or flow meter made by Netafim. And you'll notice we've got somewhat of an odometer reading on the top, but we have 3 dials. One dial measures each digit will represent 1 gallon, so one full rotation of this dial is 10 gallons. This dial is 0.1. Each one of these digits will represent 1/10 of a gallon, so one full rotation here would be 1 gallon. And on this dial, it is 0.01 gallon per digit, so 1/100th of a gallon. So each rotation here would actually be 1/10 of a gallon. So when we're reading this, the first black background number is actually 100 gallons. The next digit is the tens gallon, so 220 gallons. And because we're between 0 and 1 on the single digit meter, we're going to just use that as 0. So if we were going to then record what this dial actually said, it would be 220.6. We're putting 6/10, 4/100ths of a gallon. Getting down to the 100s is not important, but it just indicates that's how we read this meter. These first 2 digits are 110, 100s and tens. Single digits will be read off of this meter, and tenths off the middle meter. Now what that means is when we're actually going to measure the flow, we don't have to do any math. We simply turn on the pump, turn valves 1 and 2 to manual or hand. We let the system pressurize. Once we're not gaining any more pressure, we're at about 50 psi. All we have to do is count the rotations of this middle dial. Each rotation again is 1 gallon. So with our smartphone, all we have to do is in 1 minute time count the number of rotations, and that's our emitter discharge rate or flow. So it's very easy to verify. Again, our flow rates with our relative Oscar coils: 0.35 gallons a minute for the OS50s, zero point 0.7 gallons per minute with the 100 OS100 coils. Now, once we verified that valves 1 and 2 work, we need to test the backflush. Now, our disc filter, the normal flow through the filter is once water comes into the disc filter housing, it actually flows from the outside of the discs to the inside and then flows from the center of the disc out to the coils. So what we're going to do is we're going to reverse this flow and put all the pressure and flow on the internal portion of this disc filter. To do that, we're going to need hydraulic pressure, which we turn pump number 1 on. And then valves 3 and 4 we're going to energize. Valves 1 and 2 and 5 will be off. And so the flow through our headworks will be represented by this yellow line. We're going to go backwards through the disc filter and then exit what we call the vent line, going back to the tanks. And the flow path would look like so. From the pump, in through the headworks, backwards through the disc filter, out our two-tank or vent, what I call the vent line, and then it doses back into the inlet of our pump chamber. Now we know those floats, or excuse me, we know that those valves are wired correctly when we get these pressures. Gauge 1 will have about 10 psi. Gauge 2 will be about twice that amount, usually around 20. Sometimes these will be 12 and 18 or 9 and 19, something like that. But you're looking at about a 2-to-1 ratio. Again, gauge 2 will always be higher than gauge 1, and we shouldn't have any pressure registered on gauge 3. Again, that's just a verification of that the valves were wired correctly. The other thing, I'm going to go back one slide. The other thing we'll notice is the flow of water coming into this tank will be quite high. It's about 28 to close to 30 gallons a minute. Again, we're going from here, a very short distance, back in the tank. So there's not a whole lot of friction loss that we're going to find here. So the flow rate will be quite high. Now what's happening on that disc filter, this is a cartridge that was in one of our NSF tests that was run for 7 to 8 months, and there was no cleaning, only the back flushing that was taking place. You can see that we only cleaned portions of the disc filter on the outside, but these discs have some internal volume for filtering, and that's the part that we're actually cleaning the most. This filter allowed us to operate with the same flow, the same pressure for 8 months, from the very beginning of the test to the very end of the test. So this backflush, even though this looks like a dirty filter, the backflushing capability keeps this quite clean. Now once we've tested the disc filter backflush, we need to verify that valve number 5, or a coil flush valve, works correctly. So now we're going to turn on pump 1. We're going to go back to valves 1 and 2. We're going to turn off valves 3 and 4, and we're going to turn on valve 5. And now our flow path is going to resemble the dose, except that we've opened up valve 5, and now we're going to allow that excess pressure to vent back into the tank. And so this is what the flow path will look like. The flow rate coming in during this cycle will be about half the flow rate that it was when we did the disc filter backflush. We've got a lot more pipe, there's a lot more friction loss, we are losing pressure and flow out the coils, so we would expect to see less of a flow during this cycle than the backflush disc cycle. We validate or verify that the valves are wired correctly. In this case, we should have about 40 or so psi on gauges 1 and 2, and usually it's 0 on gauge 3. Sometimes that the needle may bounce or register 1 or 2 psi, but always it's very, very low, or 0. If we were to actually measure the flow, we would want to see a minimum of about 12 gallons a minute. It says PSI, but it's 12 gallons a minute on the flow. So the next question is, well, what do we record? We've gone through all this. Really, we only need 4 pieces of information. And that is, we want to record the pressures on all 3 of the gauges during the dose. And then we want to record the dose flow rate. And this is something that we want to be able to refer back to in future maintenance to make sure, A, we're either properly backflushing that disc filter, the emitters aren't plugging, or we don't have a break in the line. If we have these 3 pressures and the flow from the original dose or original setup, going forward, again, we can verify whether our system's functioning hydraulically correctly or not. So again, on our forward flow, we be registering the pressures on gauge 1 through 3. Again, here's our pressures, and the only variable we're going to have here is going to be the flow. Again, depending upon whether we've got 5 coils, 10 coils, 8, depending on whether they're OS50s or OS100s. If we're not sure or can't get a hold of somebody, we have manuals on our website for design, operation, and maintenance, as well as installation. And in all 3 of those manuals, we have tables. This is one for the 5-foot coil. We also have one for the 100 gallon a day coil. And it would give a breakdown of how many coils are in that design flow. It would also give us what that dose flow rate should be on paper. And again, the minimum flow rate when we're doing the flush rate. Basically, our startup is now complete. We know that all the floats, pumps, and solenoid valves are wired correctly. We have validated and recorded the pressures and flows. It's important now at this point that we put all the toggle switches in the auto position or up position, and all the breakers are on. Again, those are all in the up. So all you really need to remember is toggle switches and breakers before you leave them in the on position, irregardless of whether the house is occupied or not. It's better to leave those on. That way no one has to remember to turn them on. The system will not run with a low level because there won't be any water to lift the bottom float, so it'll just wait for someone to start using water. Now, the main portion of what we're talking about, operation and maintenance, we really need to look at the entire system. The startup, as you can see here, is actually part of an operation and maintenance check. It's probably the most complicated to learn of everything that we will talk about, but it is integral to an O&M checklist checklist. First, we want to look at what I call green striping. Again, go through the startup process. We're going to be looking at the pressures, or record the pressures and flows, but we're also going to measure and record solids accumulations in the tanks, and again, then we're going to record all this data. Now, what I referred to as green striping, we've got two different Oscars here and 2 different applications. This one is at the end of summer. It's been very dry, not a lot of rain. So you can see we've got lush green grass growth over the coils. And over this one, we've got the same kind of lush green grass growth, but we also have green grass, but not quite as lush, adjacent to the coils. So either one of these would be considered normal. What we don't want to see is a bunch of water or mushy spots someplace. For instance, here's an Oscar that has a little bit of trouble. Actually, the Oscar itself is in good shape. It's just it's the site that it was installed in is somewhat problematic. This particular unit was installed in the middle of winter. There was about 5, 6 inches of snow on the ground. So when they placed the sand, they smeared and compacted the soils a little bit. The other thing they did, you see this dry area over here, they stockpiled and compacted the overburden from the tank holes below the bottom of the Oscar. So it's really important that these areas be maintained in their as much as natural condition as possible. You can see that from the Oscar, we you can see how green the Oscar is, but the flow is actually going at an angle. So all this compaction here in the soil is forcing or condensing all the water into one location. And in the wintertime, we get a lot of actually clear water that's flowing on the surface of the ground. I didn't take a picture, but there is actually standing water at this base of this fence. Again, there were some installation issues done at the wrong time, and then having the overburden here would be a problem. This would definitely be an indication of green striping that's not good. I'm going to go back a couple slides, and this is an indication of green striping that's very good. Now, part of the O&M process, we really want to redo the startup procedures. Um, this will verify that on the day that we've done the inspection that all the electrical and hydraulic functions are good, that we're working properly. If for some reason when we do the startup process that we're not getting the proper pressures and flows, that will point us in the direction of where the problem is. Once we do that, we're starting to get into troubleshooting, and we have a whole bunch of steps written in our operation and maintenance manual, which is posted on the website. And of course, at this point, you're more than welcome to give Low Ridge a call, and we can walk you through a couple things to identify where an issue may be. Again, if we're not getting the proper pressures and flows we expected. The treatment vessel, again, depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in, if it's a simple septic tank, you'll probably want to have the tanks pumped when about 1/3 to 1/2 of the vessel's full of organic solids. If you have an additional treatment unit um, that's ahead of the tank, you probably want to follow that technology's requirements for operation and maintenance. Now, in the discharge tank, we do want to measure for solids. Once we start accumulating up to the intake of the pump, it's probably time to waste off these solids. Depending on the circumstances and what you're allowed to do, you may be able to just to put a small centrifugal pump in here and pump off a good portion of the solids into the septic tank or the treatment vessel. In other cases, you may need to just evacuate the tank and haul everything off. You will see some light film accumulating on the top of the surface of the water. That would be normal. That would not be a big issue. Again, we want to really kind of look at the liquid itself. Take a look. As long as it's clear, wasn't too cloudy, that'd be fine. Again, depending whether we got a treatment vessel, where we got another technology in front, or whether this is just septic tank effluent. And then what we want to record with the maintenance inspection, at a minimum, we want to record the condition of the Oscar. And it's important here that we want to just state what your observations are. You kind of want to avoid making judgment calls, but if you can say, lush green grass grow, dry around the edges, these kinds of things, that make sense. Again, state your observations. The other thing we want to do, record the pressures during our dose cycle, record the flow rate during the dose cycle, and then record whatever solids accumulations we have in the tank, and if any functions were done. If we've cleaned the filter, if we had things pumped, obviously we would want to record that information as well. Thanks for your interest in the Oscar low flow, with just the Oscar 2 system. If you have any questions, please feel free on our website, send us an email, give us a call. Happy to answer any questions. Thanks so much.